reading The Theory of Film, The Redemption of Physical Reality by Siegfried Kracauer, The Establishment, or Chapter 3, The Establishment of Physical Existence. Quote, "The task I'm trying to achieve is above all to make you see," end quote. D.W. Griffith to an interviewer in 1913. In establishing physical existence, films differ from photographs in two respects. They represent reality as it evolves in time, and they do so with the aid of cinematic techniques and devices. Consequently, the recording and revealing duties of the two kindred media coincide only in part. And what do they imply for film in particular? ? The hunting ground of the motion picture camera is, in principle, unlimited. It is the external world expanding in all directions. Yet there are certain subjects within that world which may be termed, quote, cinematic, end quote, because they seem to exert a peculiar attraction on the medium. It is as if the medium were predestined and eager. It is as if the medium were predestined and eager to exhibit them. The following pages are devoted to a close examination of these cinematic subjects. Several lie, so to speak, on the surface. They will be dealt with under the title, quote, recording functions, end quote. Others would hardly come to our attention or be perceptible were it not for the film camera and or the intervention of cinematic techniques. They will be discussed in the subsequent section, quote, revealing functions, end quote. To be sure, any camera revelation involves recording, but recording on its part need not be revealing. Recording functions, movement. At least two groups of quite common external phenomena are naturals for the screen. As might be expected, one is made up of all kinds of movements. These being cinematic because only the motion picture camera is able to record them. Among them are three types which can be considered cinematic subjects par excellence. The chase. Quote, "The chase," end quote, says Hitchcock, quote, "seems to me the final expression of the motion picture medium," end quote. This complex of interrelated movements is motion at its extreme. One might almost say motion as such, and of course, it is immensely serviceable for establishing a continuity of suspenseful physical action. Hence the fascination the chase has held since the beginning of the century. The primitive French comedies availed themselves of it to frame their space-devouring adventures. Gendarmes pursued a dog who eventually turned the tables on them. Corstet, sergeants de ville, pumpkins gliding from a cart were chased by the grocer, his donkey, and passers-by through sewers and over roofs. La Course des Patrons, 1907, English title, The Pumpkin Race. For any Keystone comedy, to forego the chase would have been an unpardonable crime. It was the climax of the whole, its orgiastic finale, a pandemonium with onrushing trains telescoping into automobiles and narrow escapes down ropes that dangled above a lion's den. But perhaps nothing reveals the cinematic significance of this reveling in speed more drastically than D.W. Griffith's determination to transfer, at the end of all his great films, the action from the ideological plane to that of his famous, quote, last-minute rescue, end quote, which was a chase pure and simple, or should one say a race, question mark. In any case, the rescuers rush ahead to overwhelm the villains or free their victims at the very last moment, while simultaneously the inner emotion which the dramatic conflict has aroused yields to a state of acute physiological suspense called forth by exuberant physical motion and its immediate implications. Nor is a genuine Western imaginable without a pursuit or a race on horseback. As Flaherty put it, Westerns are popular, quote, because people never get tired of seeing a horse gallop across the plains, end quote. Its gallop seems still to gain momentum by contrast with the immense tranquility of the faraway horizon. Dancing. The second type of specifically cinematic movement is dancing. This does not apply, of course, to the stage ballet, which evolves in a space-time outside actuality proper. Interestingly enough, all attempts at, quote, canning, end quote, it adequately have so far failed. Screen reproductions of theatrical dancing either indulge in a completelessness, which is boring, or offer a selection of attractive details which confuse in that they dismember rather than preserve the original. Dancing attains to cinematic eminence only if it is part and parcel of physical reality. Rene Clair's early sound films have judiciously been called ballets. True, they are, but the performers are real-life Parisians who just cannot help executing dance movements when going about their love adventures and minor quarrels. With infinite subtlety, Clair guides them along the divide between the real and unreal. Sometimes it appears as though these delivery boys, taxi drivers, girls, clerks, shopkeepers, and nondescript figures are marionettes banding together and parting from each other according to designs as delicate as lacework, and then again they are made to look and behave like ordinary people in Paris streets and bistros. And the latter impression prevails, for even granted that they are drawn into an imaginary universe, this universe itself reflects throughout our real world in stylizing it. What dancing there is seems to occur on the spur of the moment. It is the vicissitudes of life from which these ballets issue. Fred Astaire, too, prefers apparent impromptu performances to stage choreography. He is quite aware that this type of performance is appropriate to the medium. Quote, each dance, end quote, says he, quote, ought to spring somehow out of character or situation. Otherwise, it is simply a vaudeville act, end quote. This does not mean that he would dispense with theatrical production numbers, but no sooner does he perform in vaudeville fashion than he breaks out of the prison of prearranged stage patterns and, with a genius for improvisation, dances over tables and gravel paths into the everyday world. It is a one-way route which invariably leads from the footlights to the heart of the camera reality. Astaire's consummate dancing is meant to belong among the real-life events with which he toys in his musicals, and It is so organized that it imperceptibly emerges from and disappears in the flow of these happenings. But what could be more inseparable from the flow than, quote, natural, end quote, dancing, question mark. Time and again, filmmakers have trained their cameras on dancing couples and scenes of social dancing, as if irresistibly attracted by the cinematic nature of movements which grow out of life itself. Think of the beautiful ballroom episodes in Jezebel and Pygmalion, or the elaborate can-can sequence in Moulin Rouge. And there is Roger Tilton's documentary Jazz Dance, an apt montage of candid shots conveying the collective ecstasy of jazz addicts. Every moviegoer will recall no end of examples. Records of dancing sometimes amount to an intrusion into the dancer's intimate privacy. His self-forgetting rapture may show in queer gestures and distorted facial expressions which are not intended to be watched, save by those who cannot watch them because they themselves participate in the dancing. Looking at such secret displays is like spying. You feel ashamed for entering a forbidden realm where things are going on which must be experienced, not witnessed. However, the supreme virtue of the camera consists precisely in acting the voyeur. Nascent motion. The third type of motion, which offers special interest cinematically, is not just another group of interrelated movements, but movement as contrasted with motionlessness. In focusing upon this contrast, films strikingly demonstrate that objective movement, any movement for that matter, is one of their choice subjects. Alexander Davinsky, in both Arsenal and Earth, frequently stops the action to resume it after a short lull. The first phase of this procedure, characters or parts of them abruptly ceasing to move, produces a shock effect, as if all of a sudden we found ourselves in a vacuum. The immediate consequence is that we acutely realize the significance of the movement as an integral element of the external world as well as film. But this is only part of the story. Even though the moving images on the screen come to a standstill, the thrust of their movement is too powerful to be discontinued simultaneously. Accordingly, when the people in Arsenal or Earth are shown in the form of stills, the suspended movement nevertheless perpetuates itself by changing from outer motion into inner motion. Davinsky has shown how to make this metamorphosis benefit his penetrations of reality. The immobile lovers in Earth become transparent. The deep happiness which is moving them turns inside out, and the spectator on his part grasps their inward agitation because the cessation of external motion moves him all the more intensely to commune with them. Yet, despite these rewarding experiences, he cannot help feeling a certain relief when eventually the characters take on life again, an event which marks the second and final phase of the procedure. It is a return to the world of film, whose inherent motion alone renders possible such excursions into the whirlpool of the motionless. Instead of transforming Davinsky fashion, moving life into live immobility, the filmmaker may also contrast movement with any of the innumerable phases comprising it. In the beach episode of the silent German film Männchen Santage, a remarkable semi-documentary of 1929, snapshots of the bathers taken by a photographer on the spot are inserted in different places, and the snapshots snatch from the flow of the movement precisely such bodily postures as are bizarre and, in a sense, unnatural. The contrast between the bustling bodies and the poses they assume in the cut-ins could not be stronger. At the sight of these rigid and ludicrous poses, the spectator cannot help identifying motionlessness with lifelessness. Accordingly, life with movement, and still under the impact of the preceding commotion, he is at the same time likely to react to the sudden change from meaningful thème d'arrêt into mechanical thème escape with spontaneous laughter. Unlike the Dovzhenko stills, which draw him deeper and deeper into their orbit, the snapshots of the beach strike him as funny for freezing life into an absurd standstill. It is worth mentioning that they had also the sociological function of exposing the ideological emptiness of lower middle class people of the period. Inanimate objects. Since the inanimate object is featured in many paintings, one might question the legitimacy of characterizing it as a cinematic object. Yet it is a painter, Fernand Lager, who judiciously insists that only film is equipped to sensitize us by way of big close-ups to the possibilities that lie dormant in a hat, a chair, a hand, and a foot. Similarly, Cohen Siat, quote, and I, question mark, says the leaf which is falling, and we, question mark, say the orange peel, the gust of wind, film, whether intentionally or not, is their mouthpiece, end quote. Nor should it be forgotten that the camera's ability to single out and record the orange peel or the hand marks a decisive difference between screen and stage. So close to each other in some respects, stage imagery inevitably centers on the actor, whereas film is free to dwell on parts of his appearance and detail the objects about him. In using its freedom to bring the inanimate to the fore and make it a carrier of action, film only protests its peculiar requirements to explore all of physical existence, human or non-human. Within this context, it is of interest that in the early 20s, when the French cinema was swamped with theatrical adaptations and stage-minded dramas, Louis Deluc tried to put the medium on its own feet by stressing the tremendous importance of objects. If they are assigned the role due to them, he argued, the actor too, quote, is no more than a detail, a fragment of the matter of the world, end quote. Actually, the urge to raise hats and chairs to the status of full-fledged actors has never completely atrophied. From the malicious escalators, the unruly Murphy beds, and the mad automobiles in silent comedy to the cruiser Potemkin, the oil derrick in Louisiana Story, and the dilapidated kitchen in Umberto D, a long procession of unforgettable objects has passed across the screen. objects which stand out as protagonists and all but overshadow the rest of the cast. Or remember the powerful presence of environmental influences in The Grapes of Wrath, the part played by Nocturnal Coney Island in Little Fugitive, the interaction between the marshland and the guerrilla fighters in the last episode of Pasan. Of course, the reverse holds true also. Films in which the inanimate merely serves as a background to self-contained dialogue in the closed circuit of human relationships are essentially uncinematic. Revealing functions. Quote, I ask that a film discover something for me, end quote, declares Louis Buñuel, who is himself a fiery pathfinder on the screen. And what are films likely to discover? Question mark. The evidence available suggests that they assume three kinds of revealing functions. They tend to reveal things normally unseen, phenomena overwhelming consciousness, and certain aspects of the outer world which may be called, quote, special modes of reality, end quote. Things normally unseen. The many material phenomena which elude observation under normal circumstances can be divided into three groups. The first includes objects too small to be readily noticed or even perceived by the naked eye, and objects so big that they will not be fully taken in either. The small and the big. The small is conveyed in the form of close-ups. D.W. Griffith was among the first to realize that they are indispensable for cinematic narration. He initiated their use, as we now know it, in After Many Years, 1908, an adaptation of Tennyson's Enoch Arden. There his memorable first close-up appeared within context, which Louis Jacobs describes as follows, quote, going further than he had ventured before, in a scene showing Annie Lee brooding and waiting for her husband's return, Griffith daringly used a large close-up of her face. He had another surprise, even more radical, to offer. Immediately following the close-up of Annie, he inserted a picture of the object of her thoughts, her husband cast away on a desert isle, end quote. On the surface, this succession of shots seems simply designed to lure the spectator into the dimension of her intimate preoccupations. He first watches Annie from a distance and then approaches her so closely that he sees only her face. If he moves on in the same direction as the film invites him to do, it is logical that he should penetrate Annie's appearance and land inside her mind. Granting the validity of this interpretation, the close-up of her face is not an end in itself. Rather, along with the subsequent shots, it serves to suggest what is going on behind that face. Annie's longing for reunion with her husband, a knowingly chosen detail of her physique, thus would establish the whole of her being in a dramatic interest. The same obviously holds true of another famous Griffith close-up, Mae Marsh's clasped hands in the trial episode of Intolerance. It almost looks as if her huge hands with the convulsively moving fingers were inserted for the sole purpose of illustrating eloquently her anguish at the most crucial moment of the trial, as if, generally speaking, the function of any such detail exhausted itself in intensifying our participation in the total situation. This is how Eisenstein conceives of the close-up. Its main function, says he, is, quote, not so much to show or to present as to signify, to give meaning, to designate, end quote. To designate what? Question mark. Evidently, something of importance to the narrative. And montage-minded as he is, he immediately adds that the significance of the close-up for the plot accrues to it less from its own content than from the matter in which it is juxtaposed with the surrounding shots. According to him, the close-up is primarily a montage unit. But is this really its only function? Question mark. Consider again the combination of shots with the close-up of Annie's face. The place assigned to the latter in the sequence intimates that Griffith wanted us also to absorb the face for its own sake instead of just passing through and beyond it. The face appears before the desires and emotions to which it refers have been completely defined, thus tempting us to get lost in the puzzling interdeterminacy, or lost in its puzzling interdeterminacy. Annie's face is also an end in itself, and so is the image of Mae Marsh's hands. No doubt it is to impress upon us her inner condition, but besides making us experience what we would in a measure have experienced anyway because of our familiarity with the characters involved, this close-up contributes something monumentous and unique. It reveals how her hands behave under the impact of utter despair. Eisenstein criticizes the close-ups in Griffith films precisely for their relative independence of the context in which they occur. He calls them isolated units which tend, quote, to show or to present, end quote, and he insists that to the extent that they indulge in isolation, they fail to yield the meanings which the interweaving processes of montage may elicit from them. Had Eisenstein been less possessed with the magic powers of montage, he would certainly have acknowledged the cinematic superiority of the Griffith close-up. To Griffith, such huge images of small material phenomena are not only integral components of the narrative, but disclosures of new aspects of physical reality. In representing them the way he does, he seems to have been guided by the conviction that the cinema is all the more cinematic if it acquaints us with the physical origins, ramifications, and connotations of all the emotional and intellectual events which comprise the plot, that it cannot adequately account for these inner developments unless it leads us through the thicket of material life from which they emerge and in which they are embedded. Now suppose we look at a big close-up, say Mae Marsh's hands. As we are watching them, something strange is bound to happen. We will forget that they are just ordinary hands. Isolated from the rest of the body and greatly enlarged, the hands, we know, will change into unknown organisms quivering with a life of their own. Big close-ups metamorphose their objects by magnifying them. Proust's narrator anticipates this metamorphosis in his description of an enterprise which, though it is not precisely a lover's performance, yet turns out to be a kiss. A kiss he eventually places on Albertine's cheek. Quote, as my mouth was gradually to approach the cheeks which my eyes had suggested to it that it should kiss, my eyes, changing their position, saw a different pair of cheeks, the throat, studied at closer range, and as though through a magnifying glass, shrewd in its coarse grain, a robustness which modified the character of the face, end quote. Any huge close-up reveals new and unexpected formations of matter. Skin textures are reminiscent of aerial photographs. Eyes turn into lakes or volcanic craters. Such images blow up our environment in a double sense. They enlarge it literally, and in doing so, they blast the prison of conventional reality, opening up expanses which we have explored at best in dreams before. It is not the big close-up alone which changes familiar sights into unusual patterns. Like it, diverse cinematic techniques and devices draw on shots of physical reality to evolve pictures or combinations of pictures which deviate from the conventional image of that reality. An interesting case in point is Khrushchev's, quote, creative geography, end quote, a device which dissolves given spatial interrelationships. Pictures of material phenomena taken in different places are juxtaposed in such a way that their combination evokes the illusion of a spatial continuity, which of course is found nowhere in nature. The artificial space thus created is mostly intended as an excursion into the realm of fantasy, which does not imply that it might not as well be made to bring out inherent potentialities of physical reality itself. In René Clair's Entraat, for instance, the camera tilts from the lower half of the ballerina up to the head of the bearded male so as to suggest playfully an impossible figure composed of these disparate pieces. And in Maya Deren's study in choreography for camera, a dancer lifts his leg in the woods and puts it down in a private room, thereby becoming part of a scenery whose unreal changes recall the intangible transitions of dream images. Or think of the insertion of negatives and the reversal of time. They certainly go far in defying our habits of seeing. Other types of this bizarre imagery will be discussed later. Together, they occupy an area which may be called, quote, reality of another dimension, end quote, or contrived reality, end quote. Now these deviant images raise a fascinating problem. What exactly is their relation to physical existence proper? Question mark. Critics ranking the cinema on a level with the traditional arts refer to instances of reality of another dimension in support of their opinion that films are not, or at least need not be, primarily concerned with the rendering of the given outer world, and that accordingly the filmmaker is at liberty to neglect its representation in favor of whatever visions or fantasies he wants to convey. But this is a crude approach to the problem. Actually, contrived reality pictures, such as the big close-up of Mae Marsh's hands, are ambiguous. They may or may not bear a physical reality as commonly perceived. If they form part of an otherwise realistic film, they are likely to affect us as an outgrowth of the same realism which animates the rest of the picture. They will be conceived, that is, as disclosures of hidden aspects of the world about us. Thus, Mae Marsh's hands deepen our insight into the bodily components of the whole of her existence. Similarly, certain shots in jazz dance, which, taken out of the context, would hardly resemble any known real-life objects, initiate us into the secrets of a material universe set afire by the dancer's frenzy. If, on the other hand, pictures constituting reality of another dimension are used as elements of creative compositions unconcerned about physical reality, they lose their reality character and often impress one as freely invented shapes. Many an experimental film plays upon the ambiguity of these deviant pictures by transforming them before our eyes from representations of reality into patterns completely disengaged from the latter. In La Marche des Machines, for instance, big close-ups of machine parts, still recognizable as such, turn into rhythmically moving forms which no longer refer back to their origins. Yet, the fact that these close-ups of machine parts readily lend themselves to substituting for free-floating abstractions should not make one forget that they are essentially derivatives of camera reality. And, of course, what applies to them holds true of all types of images belonging to reality of another dimension. In consequence, these deviant images will be all the more significant if they keep close to the real-life material from which they stem. Only then can they be expected to assume the revealing functions peculiar to the medium. In its preoccupation with the small, the cinema is comparable to science. Like science, it breaks down material phenomena into tiny particles, thereby sensitizing us to the tremendous energies accumulated in the microscopic configurations of matter. These analogies may well be related to the nature of film. It is quite possible indeed that the construction of the film image from shots of minute phases of movement favors the reverse tendency toward decomposing given wholes. Is it really surprising that a medium so greatly indebted to 19th century concern for science should show characteristics inherent in the scientific approach? Incidentally, the very ideas and impulses responsible for the rise of film have also left their imprint on Proust's novel. This would account for its parallels with film, especially the sustained use Proust makes in it of the close-up. In truly cinematic fashion, he magnifies throughout the smallest elements or cells of reality, as if prompted by a desire to identify them as the source and seat of the explosive forces which make up life. The big. Among the large objects, such as vast plains or panoramas of any kind, one deserves special attention: the masses. No doubt imperial Rome already teemed with them. But masses of people in the modern sense entered the historical scene only in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. Then they became a social force of first magnitude. Warring nations resorted to levies on an unheard of scale, and identifiable groups yielded to the anonymous multitude which filled the big cities in the form of amorphous crowds. Walter Benjamin observes that in the period marked by the rise of photography, the daily sight of moving crowds was still a spectacle to which eyes and nerves had to get adjusted. The testimony of sensitive contemporaries would seem to corroborate this sagacious observation. The Paris crowds omnipresent in Baudelaire's La Fleur du Mal functions as stimuli which call forth irritating kaleidoscopic sensations. The jostling and shoving passers-by who, imposed man of the crowd, throng gaslit London provoke a succession of electric shocks. At the time of its emergence, the mass, this giant animal, was a new and upsetting experience. As might be expected, the traditional arts proved unable to encompass and render it. Where they failed, photography easily succeeded. It was technically equipped to portray crowds as the accidental agglomerations they are. Yet only film, the fulfillment of photography in a sense, was equal to the task of capturing them in motion. In this case, the instrument of reproduction came into being almost simultaneously with one of its main subjects. Hence the attraction which masses exerted on still and motion picture cameras from the outset. It is certainly more than sheer coincidence that the very first Lumiere films featured a crowd of workers and the confusion of arrival and departure at a railway station. Early Italian films elaborated upon the theme, and D.W. Griffith, inspired by them, showed how masses can be represented cinematically. The Russians absorbed his lesson, applying it in ways of their own. The fact that big objects are inaccessible to the stage as small ones suffices to range them among the cinematic objects. Any such object, say a wide landscape, may be recorded by a long distance shot, but despite their significance in Griffith films, shots of this type are seldom enough to establish a large phenomenon to the full. There is something to reveal about it which is not given away in the total picture of it. The big differs from the small in that it can be exhausted only by a combination of pictures taken from different distances. Faced with the task of capturing the substance of a large-scale landscape, film ought to proceed like a tourist who, in strolling through that landscape, lets his eyes wander about so that his ultimate image of it will be composed of sundry details and vistas. Consider a street demonstration. Quote, in order to receive a clear and definite impression of the demonstration, end quote, says Podovkin, quote, the observer must perform certain actions. First, he must climb upon the roof of a house to get a view from above of the procession as a whole, and measure its dimension. Next, he must come down and look out through the first floor window at the inscriptions carried by the demonstrators. Finally, he must mingle with the crowd to gain an idea of the outward appearance of the participants. End quote. All these obligations may be taken care of by a single traveling shot, which successively shows the ensemble and diverse elements of it. But the most primitive, most common procedure is a juxtaposition of long shots and close shots. Whether such a combination of pictures begins with a long shot or a close shot is as immaterial as is the number of shots used in the process. What does matter is that the alternating shots launch the spectator on a movement, enabling him really to grasp the street demonstration or whatever tends to overwhelm him through its oversized proportions. Even though this editing unit assumes a particularly incisive function when applied to big objects, it is also needed for penetrations of normal-sized phenomena, descriptions, that is, which do not confine themselves to duplicating conventional reality. Griffith closes in on Annie's face only after having presented her whole figure, and it is in effect the combination of these two or more shots out of which her image arises. The sequence long shot, close shot, long shot, etc. is a basic editing sequence. The general use made of this sequence points to another resemblance between cinematic and scientific procedures. Science postulates principles bearing on the nature of the universe or some dimension of it, deduces their implications, and tries to verify them by experiment and observation, the physical universe being indefinable. This is an endless process involving ever new hypotheses, ever new verifications. Facts emerge which do not conform to the original propositions. Consequently, more fitting propositions must be evolved and again tested, and so on. It is a process which can also be described as a continuous to and fro movement between the hypothesized qualities of complex entities and the observed qualities of their elements, which partly elude direct observation, though. The similarity between this movement and the editing sequence long shot, close shot, long shot, etc., consists precisely in their common aspiration to comprehend each in its way, large ensembles, and eventually nature itself. The second group of things normally unseen compromises the transient. The transient. That's the heading. The transient. The second group of things normally unseen compromises the transient. Here belong, first, fleeting impressions, quote, the shadow of a cloud passing across the plain, a leaf which yields to the wind, end quote, evanescent like dream elements. Such impressions may haunt the moviegoer long after the story they are called upon to implement has sunk into oblivion. The maims of the galloping horses, flying threads or streamers rather than manes. In the chariot race episode of Fred Niblow's Ben-Hur, as are unforgettable as the fiery traces of the projectiles that tear the night in Desert Victory. The motion picture camera seems to be partial to the least permanent components of our environment. It may be anticipated that the street, in the broadest sense of the word, is a place where impressions of this kind are bound to occur. Quote, the cinema, end quote, says Aragon, delighting in its snapshot-like predilection for the ephemeral, quote, has taught us more about man in a few years than centuries of painting have taught. Fugitive expressions, attitudes scarcely credible yet real, charm and hideousness, end quote. Second, there are movements of so transitory a nature that they would be imperceptible were it not for two cinematic techniques: accelerated motion, which condenses extremely slow and hence unobservable developments such as the growth of plants, and slow motion, which expands movements too fast to be registered. Like the big close-up, these correlated techniques lead straight into, quote, reality of another dimension, end quote. Pictures of stalks piercing the soil in the process of growing open up on imaginary areas, and racing legs shown in slow motion do not just slow down but change in appearance and perform bizarre evolutions, patterns remote from reality as we know it. Slow motion shots parallel the regular close-ups. They are, so to speak, temporal close-ups achieving in time what the close-up proper is achieving in space. That, unlike the latter, they are used rather infrequently, may be traced to the fact that the enlargement of the spatial phenomena as effected by the close-up seems more, quote, natural, end quote, to us than the expansion of a given time interval. On the other hand, it appears that filmmakers draw more readily on slow motion than on the reverse technique, perhaps simply because it does not require so lengthy preparation. As contrived reality pictures, the deviant images gained by both techniques, especially slow motion, may well figure in non-realistic experimental films. Yet they live up to the cinematic approach only if they are made to fulfill a revealing function within context focusing on physical existence. The late Gene Epstein, who felt so immensely attracted by, quote, reality of another dimension, end quote, considered this their true destination, referring to waves in slow motion and clouds in accelerated motion. He declared that for all their, quote, startling physics and strange mechanics, end quote, they, quote, are but a portrait seen in a certain perspective of the world in which we live, end quote. Blind spots of the mind. The third and last group of things normally unseen consists of phenomena which figure among the blind spots of the mind. Habit and prejudice prevent us from noticing them. The role which cultural standards and traditions may play in these processes of elimination is drastically illustrated by a report on the reactions of African natives to a film made on the spot. After the screening, the spectators, all of them still acquainted with the medium, talked volubly about a chicken they allegedly had seen picking food in the mud. The filmmaker himself, entirely unaware of its presence, attended several performances without being able to detect it. Had it been dreamed up by the natives? Only by scanning his film foot by foot did he eventually succeed in tracing the chicken. It appeared for a fleeting moment somewhere in a corner of a picture and then vanished forever. The following types of objects are cinematic because they stubbornly escape our attention in everyday life. Unconventional complexes. Film may bear real-life complexes which the conventional figure ground patterns usually conceal from view. Imagine a man in a room, accustomed as we are to visualize the human figure as a whole. It would take us an enormous effort to perceive instead of the whole man a pictorial unit consisting, say, of his right shoulder and arm, fragments of furniture, and a section of the wall. But this is exactly what photography and, more powerfully, film may make us see. The motion picture camera has a way of disintegrating familiar objects and bringing to the fore, often just in moving about, previously invisible interrelationships between parts of them. These newly arising complexes lurk behind the things known and cut across their easily identifiable context. Jazz dance, for instance, abounds with shots of ensembles built from human torsos, clothes, scattered legs, and whatnot, shapes which are almost anonymous. In rendering physical existence, film tends to reveal configurations of semi-abstract phenomena. Sometimes these textures take on an ornamental character. In the Nazi propaganda film Triumph of the Will, moving banners fuse into a very beautiful pattern at the moment when they begin to fill the screen. The refuse. Many objects remain unnoticed simply because it never occurs to us to look their way. Most people turn their backs on garbage cans, the dirt underfoot, the waste they leave behind. Films have no such inhibitions. On the contrary, what we ordinarily prefer to ignore proves attractive to them precisely because of this common neglect. Rutman's Berlin includes a wealth of sewer grates, gutters, and streets littered with rubbish, and Cavalcanti in his Rien que les hours is hardly less garbage-minded. To be sure, shots in this vein may be required by the action, but intrigues inspired by a sense of the medium are often so devised that they offer the camera ample opportunity to satisfy its inborn curiosity and function as a rag picker. Think of the old silent comedies, e.g. Chaplin's A Dog's Life, or pictures which involve crime, war, or misery. Since sights of refuse are particularly impressive after spectacles extolling the joy of living, filmmakers have repeatedly capitalized on the contrast between glamorous festivities and their dreary aftermath. We see a banquet on the screen, and then, when everybody has gone, you are made to linger for a moment and stare at the crumpled tablecloth. The half-empty glasses, and the unappetizing dishes. The classical American gangster films indulge in this effect. Scarface opens on a restaurant at dawn, with the remnants of the nocturnal orgy strewn over floors and tables, and after the gangsters' ball in Sternberg's underworld, Bancroft totters through a maze of confetti and streamers left over from the feast. The familiar. Nor do we perceive the familiar. It is not as if we shrink from it as we do in the case of refuse. We just take it for granted without giving it a thought. Intimate faces, streets we walk day by day, the house we live in. All these things are part of us like our skin, and because we know them by heart, we do not know them with the eye. Once integrated into our existence, they cease to be objects of perception, goals to be attained. In fact, we would be immobilized if we focused on them. This is confirmed by a common experience. A man entering his room will immediately feel disturbed if during his absence something has been changed in it. But in order to find out what okay, there we go. But where was I? But in order to find out about the cause of his uneasiness, he must discontinue his routine occupations, only in deliberately scrutinizing and thus estranging the room will he be able to discover what it actually is that has been changed. Proust, narrator, is acutely aware of this very estrangement when he suddenly sees his grandmother not as he always believed her to be, but as she really is, or at least as she would appear to a stranger, a snapshot likeness severed from his dreams and memories. Films make us undergo similar experience 1,000 times. They alienate our environment in exposing it. One ever recurrent film scene runs as follows. Two or more people are conversing with each other. In the middle of their talk, the camera, as if entirely indifferent to it, slowly pans through the room, inviting us to watch the faces of the listeners and various furniture pieces in a detached spirit. Whatever this may mean within the given context, it invariably dissolves a well-known total situation and thereby confronts the spectator with isolated phenomena which he previously neglected or overlooked as a matter of course components of that situation. As the camera pans, curtains become eloquent and eyes tell a story of their own. The way leads toward the unfamiliar and the familiar. How often do we not come across shots of the street corners buildings, and landscapes with which we were acquainted all our life? We naturally recognize them, and yet it is as if they were virgin impressions emerging from the abyss of nearness. The opening sequence of Vigo's Zero de Conduit shows two boys traveling back to school by train. Is it just an ordinary night trip? Vigo manages to transform a familiar railway compartment into a magic wigwam in which the two, drunk from their boast and pranks, are floating through the air. This transformation is partly achieved with the aid of a device, both photographic and cinematic, which deserves some attention: the use of uncommon camera angles. Vigo occasionally represents the railway compartment slantwise and from below, so that the whole room seems to drift along the haze from the cigars which the high-strung schoolboys are smoking, while little toy balloons hover to and fro before their pale faces. Proust knew about the alienating effect of this device. After having mentioned that certain photographs of scenery in towns are called, quote, admirable, end quote, he continues, quote, if we press for a definition of what their admirers mean by the epithet, we shall find that it is generally applied to some unusual picture of a familiar object, a picture different from those that we are accustomed to see, unusual and yet true to nature, and for that reason doubly impressive because it startles us, makes us emerge from our habits, and at the same time brings us back to ourselves by recalling to us an earlier impression, end quote. And to concretize this definition, he refers to the picture of a cathedral which does not render it as it is normally seen, namely in the middle of the town, but is taken from a point of view from which the building, quote, will appear 30 times the height of the houses, end quote. It has been observed that a little change in makeup suffices to alter the appearance of a man completely. Slight deviations from the conventional perspective are likely to be of similar consequence. In a review of Gene Epstein's Carew Fidel, which indulges in unusual camera angles, Renee Claire therefore wonders why so many film directors resort to all kinds of photographic tricks when they, quote, might arouse so much curiosity by a simple inclination of their camera, end quote. Because of their metamorphosing power, shots from unusual angles are frequently exploited for propaganda purposes. There is always the possibility that such shots may turn into contrived reality pictures. The confrontation with objects which are familiar to us for having been part and parcel of our early life is particularly stirring. Hence the peculiar, often traumatic effect of films resuscitating that period. It need not be the period of our own childhood, for in the child real experiences mingle indiscriminately with imagined ones based on picture books and grandmother tales. Such retrospects as The Golden Twenties, 50 Years Before Your Eyes, and Paris 1900, documentaries of 1950 assembled from authentic newsreels, contemporary feature films, and photographs explore patterns of custom and fashion which we once accepted unquestioningly. Now that they resume life on the screen, the spectator cannot help laughing at the ridiculous hats, overstuffed rooms, and obtrusive gestures impressed upon him by the voracious camera. As he laughs at them, however, he is bound to realize, shudderingly, that he has been spirited away into the lumber room of his private self. He himself has dwelt without knowing it in those interiors. He himself has blindly adopted conventions which now seem naive or cramped to him. In a flash, the camera exposes the paraphernalia of our former existence, stripping them of the significance which originally transfigured them so that they change from things in their own right into invisible conduits. Unlike paintings, film images encourages such a decomposition because of their emphatic concern with raw material not yet consumed. Unlike paintings, film images encourage such a decomposition because of their emphatic concern with raw material not yet consumed. The thrill of these old films that they bring us face to face with the inchoate, cocoon-like world whence we come, all the objects, or rather sediments of objects, that were our companions in a pupa state. The most familiar, which continues to condition our involuntary reactions and spontaneous impulses, is thus made to appear as the most alien. If we find these obsolete sights funny, we respond to them also with emotions which range from fright at the sudden emergence of our intimate being to nostalgic melancholy over the inexorable passing of time. Numerous films, among them Claire's The Italian Straw Hat and Les Deux Timides, and many a mystery drama laid in the Victorian era, draw on the incomparable spell of those near and faraway days which mark the broader region between the present and the past. Beyond it, the realm of history begins. Phenomena overwhelming consciousness. Elemental catastrophes, the atrocities of war, acts of violence and terror, sexual debauchery, and death are events which tend to overwhelm consciousness. In any case, they call forth excitements and agonies bound to thwart detached observation. No one witnessing such an event, let alone playing an active part in it, should therefore be expected accurately to account for what he has seen. Since the manifestations of crude nature, human or otherwise, fall into the area of physical reality, they range all the more among the cinematic subjects. Only the camera is able to represent them without distortion. Actually, the medium has always shown a predilection for events of this type. There is practically no newsreel that would not indulge in the ravages of an inundation, a hurricane, an airplane crash, or whatever catastrophe happens to be at hand. The same applies to feature films. The same applies to feature films. One of the first film strips ever made was The Execution of Mary Queen of Scots, 1895. The executioner cuts off her head and then holds it in his uplifted hand so that no spectator can possibly avoid looking at the frightful exhibit. Pornographic motifs also emerge at a very early date. The path of the cinema is beset with films revealing reveling in disasters and nightmarish incidents. Suffice it to pick out at random the war horrors of Da Vinsco's Arsenal and Pabst West Front, 1918, the terrible execution sequence at the end of Thunder over Mexico, a film based on Eisenstein's Mexican material, the earthquake in San Francisco, the torture episode in Mussolini's Open City, the depiction of a Polish Nazi concentration camp in The Last Stop, the scene with the young hoodlums wantonly mistreating a blind man in Buñuel's Los Olvidados. Because of its sustained concern with all that is dreadful and off limits, the medium has frequently been accused of a penchant for cheap sensationalism. What lends support to this verdict is the indisputable fact that films have a habit of dwelling on the sensational much longer than any moral purpose would seem to justify. It often is as if that purpose served more. I'll read it back. It is often as if the purpose served merely as a pretext for rendering a savage murder or the like. In defense of the medium, one might argue that it would not be the mass medium It would not be the mass medium it is if it failed to provide stunning sensations, and that in offering them, it only follows a venerable tradition. Since time immemorial, people have craved spectacles permitting them vicariously to experience the fury of conflagrations, the excesses of cruelty and suffering and unspeakable lust, spectacles which shock the shuddering and delighted onlooker into unseeing participation. Yet this argument misses the point. The point is, rather, that the cinema does not simply imitate and continue the ancient gladiator fights or the grand guignol, but adds something new and monumentous. It insists on rendering visible what is commonly drowned in inner agitation. Of course, such revelations conform all the more to the cinematic approach if they bear on actual catastrophes and horrors. In deliberately detailing feats of sadism in their films, Rossellini and Buñuel force the spectator to take in these appalling sights and at the same time impress them on him as real-life events recorded by the imperturbable camera. Similarly, besides trying to put across their propaganda messages, the Russian films of the 20s convey to us the proximal upheavals of real masses which, because of their emotional and spatial enormity, depend doubly upon cinematic treatment to be perceptible. The cinema, then, aims at transforming the agitated witness into a conscious observer. Nothing could be more legitimate than its lack of inhibitions in picturing spectacles which upset the mind. Thus, it keeps us from shutting our eyes to the, quote, blind drive of things, end quote. Special modes of reality. Finally, films may expose physical reality as it appears to individuals in extreme states of mind generated by such events as we have mentioned, mental disturbances, or any other external or internal causes. Supposing such a state of mind is provoked by an act of violence, then the camera often aspires to render the images which an emotionally upset witness or participant will form of it. These images also belong among the cinematic objects. They are distorted from the viewpoint of a detached observer, and they differ from each other according to the varying states of mind in which they originate. In his 10 Days That Shook the World, for instance, Eisenstein composes a physical universe reflecting exultation. This episode runs as follows. At the beginning of the October Revolution, worker delegates succeed in bringing a contingent of Cossacks over to their side. The Cossacks put their half-drawn swords with the ornamented pommels back into their sheaths, and then the two groups boisterously fraternize in a state of euphoria. The ensuing dance scene is represented in the form of an accelerated montage sequence which pictures the world as experienced by the overjoyed. In their great joy, dancers and onlookers who constantly mingle cannot help perceiving incoherent pieces of their immediate environment in motion. It is a whirling agglomerate of fragments that surrounds them, and Eisenstein captures this jumble to perfection by having followed each other in a succession which becomes ever faster with the growing ecstasy. Shots of Cossack boots executing the Kracauer, worker legs dancing through a puddle, clapping hands and faces inordinately broadened by laughter. In the world of a panic-stricken individual, laughter yields to grimacing and dazzling confusion, to fearful rigidity. At any rate, this is how Erno Metzner conceived of that world in his Überfall. Its, quote, hero, end quote, is a wretched little fellow who gets a lucky break thanks to a coin he furtively picks up in the street and then stakes in a crap game. As he walks away with his wallet stuffed, a thug follows him at a steadily diminishing distance. The man is scared. No sooner does he take to his heels than all the objects about him make common cause with his pursuer. The dark railway underpass turns into a sinister trap. Frozen threats, the dilapidated slum houses close ranks and stare at him. It is noteworthy that these effects are largely due to accomplished photography, temporarily saved by a streetwalker who puts him up in her room. The man knows that the thug continues to lie in wait for him down in the street. The curtain moves, and he feels that the room itself harbors danger. There is no escape wherever he looks. There is no escape wherever he looks. He looks into the mirror. What shines out of it are distorted reflections of his mask-like features. And I was reading The Establishment of Physical Existence, Chapter 3, The Establishment of Physical Existence in Theory of Film, The Redemption of Physical Reality by Siegfried Kracauer.